is the objective, is the experience is the experience that the ruling class would have you settle your consciousness into. Now, what that does is it renders you basically defenseless, and definitely also renders you individual. It also puts you in a position where all power that you have is granted by ruling class or one of their surrogates or intermediaries. So you don't have a voice outside of what is deposited into your head. You don't have an outlook that is not deposited into your head. And hence we got, what Freire calls the banking system of education, which props up an oppressive reality. Freire says the teacher talks about reality as if it were emotionless, static, compartmentalized, and predictable. Right. So you do not challenge the system if you understand reality to be unchanging. This kind of concept, and if you read Lenin's "What Is to Be Done," one of the things he points out is that the revolutionary's job is to show people that the system is not immortal. The ruling class is not immortal. It's not invincible, right? But this is kind of like this acceptance of reality as static is what kind of works its way back towards our consciousness and producing almost this we live as ghosts, not really interfering. We live as ghosts, not really interfering with reality. Just kind of watching it in the same way you might. Is somebody else on it? Who else needs to hit a good mute? All right. So, right. So when you come to terms, with the truth that reality is a matter of process, and also a matter of dialectical relationships, and further process perpetually created by the consciousness of the people within it, then it becomes a matter of preparing ourselves to participate in the historical process perpetually. Like, what do I have to do today in order to have this to be part of how reality is determined? Okay. One hallmark of the banking system is to keep our attention on material that is alien to us. So we get the effect that all this reality is being produced in a galaxy way more relevant than ours, like so a galaxy far away or more relevant. So we're given all of these, we're given these histories, we're given these Romans, we're given these Greeks, we're given these British, you know what I'm saying? We're given this United States as the center, or the primary, the generator of the universe, not just the center of the universe. So this is what reality is produced by these white people. And so not you, right? And therefore, hey, just take what we give you, or take what you get, because only white people actually produce reality. According to how we're taught, right? And so it's also what's interesting when it's again, like the banking system, is just remember what I've just told you, is not only is it asking you to just accept this white generation of reality, or white ruling class generation of reality. It's also within the processes of education, you're not asked to actually identify yourself within the situation. And this is one of the things that Freire is going to talk about, or is a proponent of, that we look at when we look at it. When we look at a text, you look at anything, you look to see where you exist within it. So we're presented this, we're presented this alien, this alien generator of reality, and we're not asked to see ourselves there, or we're asked to see ourselves there in with prescribed consciousness. So it's like, okay, well, where is the good and evil in this? Like we're giving these weird, we're giving myths. We're giving metaphysical, almost metaphysical protagonists to identify with, you know. But but you as reality is actually formed, which is on the backs of you and your people, right? That true whole picture is never in the conversation. So it reinforces this kind of like this almost this atrophy, this mental atrophy, to where you perpetually don't look at reality as something you can transform. It is something bigger than you, beyond you, that doesn't look like you, that you can just, you can get down, or go away, but it's not going to change. Okay. What's interesting, what this also does when you present this kind of, and this is my little riff, this is not necessarily the fairy right here, but when you present like, these subjects in these very alien ways, again, where you don't see whole pictures, and it's just like, hey, this is this compartment here, and if you don't like it, it's not for you. What it does is it sets up the situation where everything else, where they can pretend that something is a science. I forget what scientist said it, man. Oh, I'm blanking on his name. I think he's one of the preeminent astrophysicists or something like that. Today, he said, what's insidious is the illusion that the economy is a science, that economics is actually a science, when it's not at all. Right? It's just an organization of power, right? But it's not like it's not like a golden ratio appears naturally in what I mean, in everything. That's not the same for fucking stocks and derivatives and all of this thing. So that, and not just economy, political processes, all these things is presented to us like super overwhelming, and we're quick to not want our power because it just feels like something else you weren't interested in school, right? So I'll leave. It's where people like, I don't deal with politics, or even I'm not into art, or whatever you think you're not into, is just like, because reality has been presented in just such this mystifying way. Okay. So another hallmark, and returning to my Freire ramble. Another hallmark is the in its compartmentalization is therefore inducing the lie that reality is actually produced by these thousands of different autonomies. That you have a legal reality, you have a federal judicial reality that does this, and this. You have state reality, and you have economic realities. You have all of these little realities that kind of that generate their own rules, that generate their own manifestations, as opposed to being a part of one whole picture of really of oppression. So the way we're presented, again, with knowledge being so compartmental, or understanding being so compartmentalized, is we accept this kind of we accept this illusion that power just power is actually not centralized, which we know that it actually is. So a hallmark of the banking system of education is to not look for the whole, not look for the bigger pictures. And therefore, when we look at what liberation, you know, a liberatory practice is, that's another thing we look for. We look for the whole. Okay, we look for ourselves, and we look for the wholes. All right. Freire says the more completely she fills the receptacles, that's the students' receptacles, the better a teacher she is. The more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. Meekly is what what I will point out in this. So now it's not just like, okay, so it's actually the less questioning you are, the better, which again grooms you to be a good oppressed person, you know. So again, you know, we experience reality as ghosts, and the only semblance of living process we get is prescribed to us. You know, the only semblance of actually moving around reality is the hands that we're given by whatever the function is, right? So whether it's, you know, picking up a box, pulling pulling boxes off a truck at 3:30 in the morning, that's definitely my least favorite job I ever had in life. You know what I'm saying? Or or slapping or slapping cuffs on somebody or whatever. You know what I mean? This is when you're alive. This is when you're actually moving material about. Okay, when you're performing a function for some kind of expression of ruling class power. Okay, and again, so then, you know, you know, in the first chapter too, I think Freire, you know, talks about this kind of like this pomp, or this, you know, this posture of benevolence that the ruling class and the ruling class surrogates carry themselves with. It's like, let me bestow on you life. Let me put something in your mind, give you something to do, because without me, without these functions, you're nothing. Or even worse, you're naturally evil. You're naturally destructive. You're a pathogen. You're a pathology. You're a super predator. You know what I mean? You're a monster, right? Unless you accept, you know, take this, and now you are whatever the illusion is. You're a citizen. You're a good person, whatever, you know. But it just you see. Let me put it on the. Let me actually look it up. Do you see what I'm saying? Sort of. Okay. I'll continue rambling now. I wanted to actually to read this one. So the A through J, you know, and so that y'all think about like how this plays out in all processes. So mirror oppressive society as a whole. A, the teacher teaches and the students are taught, right? Think about police, think about politicians, like, you know, think about all the processes as he's rattling this off. The teacher knows everything and the student knows nothing. The teacher thinks and the students are thought about. The teacher talks and the students listen meekly. The teacher disciplines and the students are disciplined. The teacher chooses and enforces his choice and the student comply. Oh, my bad. I'm in a reading group that has been fairly successful in changing, transforming the gender problems with which these cats was writing. I don't know if y'all want to do that. So it would be like saying, I would have said them instead of, you know what I'm saying? Or okay, all right. I guess that's enough. Is that enough of a vote? All right, fuck it. Okay. So the teacher chooses and enforces their choice and the students comply. The teachers act and the students have the illusion of acting through the action of the teacher. That's like fucking everything. Again, like, man, alienation, you know, taking your power and giving it to an intermediary who's you know, just an agent of the ruling class, right? But you are nothing without their power structure. Okay. The teacher chooses the program content and the students who are not consulted adapt to it. The teacher confuses the authority of knowledge with their own professional authority, which they set in opposition to the freedom of the students. The teacher is the subject of the learning process while the pupils are mere objects. Okay, so here's the making of the dominated that you can apply to all realities, all institutional realities in society. And that domination is typified by conformity. So you take everything, you know, you take everything that you have, you take everything that you're made of, all your talents, and you conform them to ruling class hegemony. Okay, you know that's did I tell you this before? Stephen Biko, they asked Stephen Biko how did people in South Africa live with that kind of repression, you know, as enforced by violence, right? I mean, or it begins with it begins with a brutal violence, right? But how do you live with that? He said that the human psyche has to indulge in all of its processes, has to feel all of its emotions, can't just stay in a perpetual state of anger, a perpetual state of sadness, and so will conform to the, you know, to the situation. You have to find something. You have to be happy with something, proud about something, comfortable with something, pleasured by something, right? And so we, you know, we conform our minds to it. And though we may not be living in the same, or some of us might not be living with the suffering the same violence of apartheid, um, South Africa, the same rules have applied to us. And I think one of the lessons of Freire is just like, man, to get an even more intimate knowledge of how you of how you are, how your consciousness is actually operating moment to moment. Like, are you the cop right now in this very second? I don't even mean like if you, you know, real cops aside. In your head, how are you approaching this moment right now as a cop or some kind of agent of fascism, right in this very moment? Okay, you have to constantly, you know, this is something we analyze, right? Because you have been severely groomed your entire life, okay, through these type of processes, and groomed, and not just, you know, groomed by the institutions you ran up in, but also groomed by the people who love you. You know, like, this is what your family, your friends, like, you know. So even if, so you might be like the groovy one of, you might, you know, you might be the groovy sheep. But just by being, you know, if the rest of this collectively generated reality, or the majority of it is generated by people who conform to ruling class hegemony, it's fucking rubbed off on you. You know? Okay. And I guess, I mean, that's for another probably author to look at that. Maybe. But anyway. So boom, boom. Along the way, you give away all your power and processes of awareness. You're always looking to something outside of yourself and outside of your people to change. Well, for us, our wretched reality, you know, some other maybe your semi-wretched reality, or frustrated reality. I was just fucking with you. Okay, but it's always a matter of something else saving the day. Okay, you're always looking at anybody but me, or anybody except our collective, right? To be an oppressed person is to be considered a pathology, a pathogen, something malignant. that society has to put up with or help or incarcerate or kill. Okay? Um, and so, Freire understands that the whole system has to go. That you can't, so you can't really change the system from the inside. And the education is just like anything else. It's either expression of liberation or an expression of slavery. He said, well, to paraphrase, sort of, even if everything goes according to plan, quote, the press may discover through existential experience that their present way of life is irreconcilable with their vocation to become fully human. I wanted to point that one out because it's the present way of life, which is another clue. Okay, so he's going to talk about, like, so when where we find text is just looking at our, starting as a starting point, our present reality. Okay. A good tool for going through text. So if we don't have, so if the banking system is me just blah, blah, so this little portion of today is actually a little antithetical, but we're not going to be like, what is it, aestheticists about it. I'll shut up in 2 seconds. Okay, but anyway, so as opposed to depositing, what therefore is the what is the mode within a learning circle, and its communication, dialogue, right? And dialogue and an invitation to use your creativity. You're not just in the world, you, like you say, you are with the world. Okay. You're co-creating the world. I mean, this is a reality. We just kind of blindly do it, or blindly recreate, blindly co-create what we have internalized. But we're still generating reality. It's just in a hive, like, Walking Dead way. So therefore, when we approach a learning circle, it's not just like, oh, I'm in this, I'm with this, I'm co-creating this, right? So I'm not in this learning circle. I'm with this learning circle. I create this learning circle. We create this learning circle as we go along. Okay. And so it's not an individualistic experience, learning. It's a solidarity. And that's how and that's the kind of, like, that's the guiding, almost paintbrush, that's how we determine the processes of our learning circle, based on this solidarity and objective of preparing ourselves to transform reality. All right. He goes back to the necrophilia thing. Oppression, overwhelming control is necrophilic. It is nourished by love of death, not life. The banking concept of education, which serves the interests of oppression, is also necrophilic. So, and this is kind of the foundation. I know we've all heard the wise words that capitalism is a death cult, right? So it's like, when you have this reality, again, of people basically being groomed into a ghost-like existence, like we're all dead anyway, like we're dead. So it just produces death. Okay, this is like the psychic root of a genocidal system. If you're not really alive beyond the functions prescribed for you by a genocidal ruling class, then murder is inevitable. The moral of the story is that so many people are just really not alive because they're not really fully, not really fully living in their power, and not really fully living in the power of the whole, really, that we're all a part of. All right. So he also talks about, like, you have this kind of like this vicarious thing. So we're kind of like, we're encouraged to satisfy almost encouraged to satisfy our need for freedom, or our analysis of our freedom through looking at other people, right? So you can really just sit down, I mean, and you know, media and all this shit, entertainment, all this is a perfect example. You can really sit here. I can sit in this fucking room all day, have gone nowhere, done nothing except watch something, and sit here and go through all of the emotional ranges, right? Sitting here feeling, you know, I can fucking feel like I freed the galaxy. You know what I'm saying? Right? I can have freed the galaxy, or whatever the fuck, or whatever, or you know, in all adventures in between, you know, and just and just identify and just, you know, use that, almost like use these external stories, um, to satisfy my actual human need for liberation. Okay. And then what gets even more insidious is when the narrative of that liberation is just like, you know, some G.I. Joe ass bullshit, right? So now you get the feeling of liberation by looking at some actual, truly in real life, what is an agent of repression. There was just somebody just wrote about this. Just like all the cop shows, you know what I mean? All the cop shows just like reinforce, like, you know, just like why we're just like, we always want to take and say, well, what did he do, or what did she do, or what did they, excuse me, what did they do, right? It's always right there. So you know, the assertion of what the writing was that's a part of it, right? So not only is it terrible to have this kind of concept that, hey, I can just sit here and just kind of like vicariously live through somebody's imagined adventure, but it's also, you know, like even worse, you know, I can feel free by looking at the adventures of somebody who actually represses me. All right. One thing that Freire, and really I think what Freire has been emphasizing since the beginning, since the preface probably, is that we cannot use these, you can't use these banking systems in a revolutionary process. Why, I promise you I will shut up in 2 seconds, right? But you can't bring that in. And if you look at, if you look at all of our movement implosions, and I think it's pretty safe to say that the last, you know, kind of 20, 30 years of movement can be characterized as a long series of implosions. There is there is this banking system in there. Is usually one of the culprits of us trying to bring all of this counter-revolutionary consciousness that we've been groomed with, trying to bring it into movement processes. Okay. Quote, authentic liberation, the process of humanization, is not another deposit to be made into a person. Liberation is a praxis, the action and reflection of people upon their world in order to transform it. Okay. So with this kind of, well, what is he calling it now? I think he's calling it problem posing education. You know, that's the you know, liberation education. So now this contradiction between the teacher and student is resolved, and there is no teacher student. In fact, I think it's literally now teacher student student teacher, like hyphenated, right? We end you know, end of authoritarianism within the learning circle. Knowledge is no longer, you know, a property, but it's just something we share in order to figure out how to transform reality. Figure out how reality works and then how to transform it. Quote, the teacher presents the material to the students for their consideration and reconsiders their earlier considerations as the students express their own. Quote, in these relations, consciousness and the world are simultaneous. Consciousness neither perceives the world nor follows it. So, you know, we have to reimagine our relationship to knowledge. again, taking the individual, like if you want a shortcut, take the individualism out of it. So we look at our immediate reality. We're looking for holes, whole pictures. I forget, I think there was one more thing. We're also looking for implications. So kind of like back to the like, so if we're in a good learning circle and we're presented with something, what we ask ourselves is what are like the, what are the implications here? What's the backstory of everything going on here? And also, what is unfinished here? Again, showing, to reflect, to respect, to understand or to internalize the reality that reality itself is impermanent, unfinished. We are unfinished. We are constantly in flux. We are constantly changing. So you kind of, almost like not reverse engineer, but maybe just engineer the situation in which the learning process mirrors actually how reality works. Okay, so when we're sitting here looking at situations, so we okay, so what in here is in flux? Where is this thing going? What is evolving? And where did this thing come from? What's behind it? Okay. I like he said problem posing education is revolutionary futurity. I'm gonna start using that. I'm a revolutionary futurist. So again, we got the immediate surroundings to build our analysis out to bigger pictures. Anything contrary is violence. Any situation in which, quote, any situation in which some individuals prevent others from engaging in the process of inquiry is one of violence. And that warning, attempting to be human individualistically leads to having more egotistically a form of dehumanization. That might be the best lug. Well, we can't. I don't want to really be compared, but that's one hell of an understanding. Anything you go about individualistically leads to actually more dehumanization, including trying to humanize something. Again, thinking about our what we bring to a revolutionary process. Individualism, or tripping on or confusing your personal autonomy with really just systemic authority. It always this is why we implode. Right? Again, when are you the cop? Like, are you the cop right now in this very second? What kind of power do you actually want right now? All right. And that's so concludes my little ramble to situate this chapter a little bit.
Thank you so much. I hope that gives everybody a clearer picture of what we read. And if you didn't read, it caught you up. We decided to go with this structure as a test to see if anybody would call us out on the banking mode of education, and nobody did, so you all failed. I'm just kidding. Cool, great. Does anybody have anything to say about either what Tango said, any questions that you'd like to bring to the larger group? I know somebody asked, how do we know when we're being cops? Oh, but first, Amiri raised their hand. So Amiri, go for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I appreciated listening to Tango just now. And one of the things that I was thinking about when you were speaking, I wrote it down. You were talking about keeping attention to the material is like we focus on material that's alien to us, right? And then we're not asked to see ourselves in whether it's learning or education, and how that kind of reinscribes the status quo, static, metaphysical, like frame of history that we're prescribed into. And I thought that related, because one of my high school teachers that I talked to we were going back and forth about history, and I was like, journalism and education are often presented as these objective things, right? Like we need to move towards the objective. And this gave me a lot of vocabulary in thinking about it, because for me, it's like objective is in direct opposition to transformative. And so people who refer to the objective, for me, feels like a sort of maintenance of the status quo of a non-transformative imaginary of what journalism can be, right? Or what education can be. And I'm interested in hearing how you feel like objective in this like very normative Eurocentric sense, like plays into this idea of like the prescribed roles that we're within, you know. And I guess that could be for anybody, but I just made that connection because I was like, yeah, that relates a lot to how we think about journalism as this thing that we got to like maintain integrity. But a lot of like Black journalists throughout time and journalists of color have been talking about how transformative journalism can be done as a way of maintaining or steering away from what like is technically objective, you know.
Man, I really think I should shut up now, but I just 2 seconds. One rough kind of rough thing is a rough measure is a rough understanding is that so they have the illusion of objectivity, but they're selling us a ruling class narrative, right? Through, you know, what they point your attention to, what they say is significant, how to determine. Like, I mean, like, even like looking at an economy as far as like all news about economy, was it like, you know, what's the gross, what's, you know, what's the budget, what's the debt, what's this, that, not like how many people literally starve to death today. How many people, you know what I mean? How many people are living in tents right now? Like, you know, the angle at which they have us analyze reality, it reinforces this. It reinforces this idea that you're on an individual adventure and that you can have this individualistic engagement of reality. Again, the short, but really, you know, the shorthand is to say there's nothing that exists just for its own sake. Right. That's the illusion of this system. Even that there's some kind of like magical political power that exists, that anybody, that we all technically have access to the political process. Right. These are this is kind of like the illusion. But I'm gonna shut up though.
I wanted to pose a question to the group for just like some discussion and brainstorming. I wanted to reference the list that Tongo read to us and also is seen on page 73 in the PDF about the attitudes and practices of the banking education model that mirrors oppressive society. I was curious to know if anybody can think of other little facets of society that these practices can be seen specifically. So for example, I thought a lot about the idea of the nuclear family, right? The traditional American nuclear family with like a father and a mother and 2 children. And the idea of like, in that situation, the teacher, the one with the knowledge, is the father, right? Which contributes to a patriarchal society. I'm curious to know if anybody else has any ideas on the way that these things manifest and we can bring it to like a bigger picture idea. If you do, I encourage you. Oh, Elias, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. I was thinking about, I mean, it's easy to see this stuff in like your schools. But I don't know, it also like the smaller groups within schools, like Greek life came to mind. Even like very obviously like the military. Yeah.
Do you want to, I want to push you in Greek life, how do you mean?
I'm seeing these same like structures hierarchical structures, and like kind of like a submission of I don't have the right words, like submission of the self, I guess, or like, yeah, personal autonomy, to like a, I don't know, a dogma, like a prescribed lifestyle. That's like as broad as I can get. I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, last thing I'm gonna ask you.
Please.
What kind of larger picture oppressive machine does that contribute to, do you think?
Ooh. I mean, in the ways that like fraternities and sororities act with each other, that like obviously perpetuates rape culture. I wish I had like specific examples that weren't just like gossip from school, but yeah, I mean, toxic masculinity, a patriarchy. I mean, it kind of stacks up in the same way that, you know, the structure of the house is.
Sick, thank you. I really appreciate you going first. Next on stack is Stephanie.
Hey folks. Yeah, for me, something that really stood out the first time I read this book, which was quite a long time ago, is the way in which all of this is echoed in theater and TV and film production, and the ways in which in these spaces that often think of themselves as radical, you have these hyper hierarchical structures of commitment and giving over. I've ended up in the dance world sort of by mistake, and one of the things that has been really jarring is really teaching artists that their bodies have autonomy when they've been trained for so many years. And so also, just to echo Tongo's point towards TV, it's not just when the stories are overtly about these power structures, but almost all of them, even the ones that are overtly against in their story, the power structures, the ethics of making is super oppressive to almost everybody, and is it's a real ask what it means that most of the narratives that we see are created in these really triangulated positions where the people we're looking at and empathizing with have some of the least amount of power, but all the visibility. So they're very frontline, but not in control. So yeah, that's something that stood out to me.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Next on stack is Yagmar.
Yalmur, yes, sorry. I guess where this overall current system of banking education leads us to is overall assignment of professions. So I would see it in any kind of a title generation being a manifestation of this, wherever we have jobs and professions to provide for our families, right? So that's every day for everybody who's assuming jobs and titles, I would say, because I guess it negates the ability to become, instead of just kind of allowing your ontological kind of purpose in life to become, right? That's the whole purpose, instead of just being. I guess that's where I see it every day, mostly.
So do you mean specifically the necessity of jobs or the existence of jobs?
I guess existence of the professions in a way that, you know, we're kind of narrowly skill setting into one dimension. Yes, it is maybe required to survive financially, but maybe the way to do it is kind of to pay more attention to the process of becoming a person that's fully capable of kind of, you know, a self, conscious self. And maybe that way it's even easier to produce financial means for the communities, right? Specializations and professions and titles, which creates bureaucracy overall in, you know, social level, right? Which is not something that allows us to kind of continue to become every day and change and kind of adapt, I think.
And I think that, yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think it also speaks to, it leads into an anti-capitalist critique, right? When we exist in this economic structure that necessitates inequity and inequality and almost necessitates the specialization of professions and careers so that some people can be the highest earning and some people can be the unskilled labor, etc., right? Because that's needed under capitalism. Then that's when we're having this this inability to become, transform, etc. Ties into the idea of reality as static, capitalism and as inequitable, etc. Thank you for sharing that. Next is Preeti.
Yeah, thank you. I think both what the two individuals before me said really resonated. One of the things that it makes me think about was when Stephanie said something about the film and TV industry, and then kind of the allusion to like classical forms of dance, and if you're taught in a certain way, you're expected, or that way is revered as the system of perfection, so to speak. The same thing exists, I think, in a lot of industries where you are not, you're not rewarded for questioning the systems or the status quo, and nor are you going to be given access to the appropriate kind of like mentor who's often the gatekeeper of information in any given system or industry. Should you question, and along with the person that spoke before me, I don't want to mispronounce your name, I was thinking about, just in terms of like the way that our economic system is set up, and the way that she described professions, is that you're not really also rewarded for, having a consciousness of your own. You're rewarded in industries for, and, other kinds of systems to conform. And so I think that it shows up like I think what you were alluding to in your question was that it shows up pretty much in all of the things that we participate in a lot of ways. And it also gives space for these types of gatekeepers to exist and decide who is going to move forward and who is not. That's what it kind of made me think of.
Absolutely. I think that's a really great way to tie both the idea of professions and also the artistic space into this larger conversation. Nobody is safe from being oppressive. Awesome. All right, next on stack is Eric.
Yeah, in addition to what everyone's saying, I think just media in general is the primary thing that comes to my mind outside of our education system, that truly just how the news is reported is through this, is in this framework of, what is objective and what is actually real, and even how, like, I haven't thought about this very deeply, but we could probably examine how language and rhetoric has been cultivated, just so that how the particular words they're using and the phrase they're using, does not give us the space to consider that, like, there's actually alternate possible realities to what is given to us. And I love what Freire is doing here, because it's like, I don't actually know if I saw him use this word, but seems like he's trying to naturally cultivate this way of dialectically thinking and viewing the world, where education and media makes us think of like growth and consciousness in terms of like an accumulation of knowledge and facts, about our objective reality. And in our capitalist system, like, that has to do with the market, and what we're given as democracy. And the market especially is this dominating force that's given to us as like an uncontrollable thing that is just naturally the way that it is, and the best of all possible worlds. And I love what's happening here, because I think of like if we can break free of this idea that we have to be accumulating knowledge, and that someone accumulates enough knowledge and they become the teacher and therefore the bestower of knowledge. You know, if we can liberate ourselves of that, then we're in a constantly evolving kind of expansion and back and forth, which is like always liberating us from past ideas and, you know, yeah, the conditioning that we are born into.
Yeah, I think you kind of tied together Amiri's point earlier about learning about journalism and history and education as something that is like objective and true. And also, I think language and rhetoric is a great thing to think about in the context of these things being implemented, right? When you, and I think this is seen a lot in like colonialism and assimilation, when you are forced to take on a language that is not your own in order to be an active participant in a society, then you lose the ability to be autonomous to a substantial degree, which I think is an important thing to think about. And thank you for bringing it up. Next on stack is Amanda.
Yeah, I think the idea that came to my mind when I was looking at this list, thank you for letting me speak, is like, because I like to paint. And so I like to paint, and I like to keep like my watercolors in my bag and take them places with me and put them out on the table and see if other people are willing to paint too. And it's really interesting to see how like fearful people are of painting. And I'll run across a bunch of folks who'll be like, no, I don't know how to paint, or like, no, I can't, I'm not good at it, and things like that. And it's interesting because it happens like at a very young age where we're taught like that we can't be trusted with our own thinking. And like, if you can't be trusted, then you're like the enemy, which is kind of scary. So it's like, if you do trust your thinking, then there's something wrong, and you're a danger to yourself and society, or to the ruling class ultimately. So that's something that comes up for me, just like the fear that's involved with that comes up around creativity. Like, how often are we how it happens all the time, the older we are, is like, how often are we in a space where we're like thinking and rethinking what we might say or do because we're scared that we might be thought of as the enemy and be, violently attacked. And so this just kind of brings me back to like thinking about how young people are, and like looking to, like, I don't know if you all are around young people. I am sometimes. And it's really interesting to see just in my own self, like when I'm around young people, how I get triggered because of their ability to be creative, and me being like, oh my God, I don't want to be oppressive, but I have feelings about this. And so like, kind of going back to like how that plays out, like that's like the cop in my mind, right? Like, why am I having all these feelings about a kid expressing themselves in any kind of way, because I might have a fear that there's going to be violence at some point for them or for us. So yeah, just like kind of going back to this idea of like going to like our younger selves and thinking about what happened to us, and when that and when we're around other young people, just watching the way that they're able to express themselves and trying to get back to that point, like trying to move back in that direction and kind of relearn, re-exist, I guess. Yeah, thank you.
So that ties in also, you have a very consistent theme of really expressing the revolutionary ways that we can take care of ourselves as members of communities, which I think is really something that we often overlook in these educational spaces. So I appreciate that. I also wanted to ask, you said that you see how people are taught at a young age that we can't trust our own thought processes. I want to ask, who do you think is doing the teaching of that? At what point are we imbued with that idea?
Well, I mean, we can go all the way back into the womb, but I don't know if we want to go there right now. Yeah, ready to take the womb trip. But we can go there. I will take you there if you want to go. I mean, I think it's just, this is another thing that comes up for me is like, I'm just going to tell you one thing that one of my counselors told me one time, is that when we blame our parents for what they did, that's when we've internalized the oppression that they were hit with. And so I guess I'll just think about that for a moment and then try to go back out into the bigger scope of like the ruling class and how the system that was created by the folks with the most power and money have been able to oppress people, and then that oppression we internalize. So this is the point where we need to do like the internal work, because we're just going to be, we can continue just to become perpetrators. So and my first thought was the adults, right? All adults are fucked up. All adults have issues. Every single adult has been hurt by many different oppressions, including young people's oppressions. So it's very likely they're going to perpetrate against a young person. But if I look bigger, that's like the bigger picture. But it starts it starts at the point of when we start growing in the womb.
Great, we love to hear it. Thank you for bringing us to the womb, even if it was for just a minute. All right, next up in stack is Aru.
Hi everyone, thank you for offering your reflections. The only thing that I wanted to add is that while reading this list of prescriptions, I was thinking about how it like reflects a fundamentally colonial relationship. I think this is something everyone's been talking about, but it made me think about how these prescriptions offered by Freire about the student-teacher dynamic in a banking model reminds me of, I was thinking about it in relationship to geopolitics, right? Like how the world is ordered based on the inequities between the global north and the global south, where the global north is often positioned, framed, justified, and perpetuated as the teacher, and like the global south and countries of the global south are folks who have to receive the civilizational mission of the West. And yeah, it just made me think about like, just from the beginning, the Western project has been this project of being the one who patronizes the rest of the world to kind of align themselves with their knowledge production. So yeah, I thought of that.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I think that it brings to mind, there's a documentary called Life in Debt, and it's about the impact that the establishment of the International Monetary Fund has had on Jamaica and Jamaica's development. And it dives very deeply into like the victimization of Jamaica by, the West, right? Like it's a fantastic documentary. I really recommend seeing it. And I think that if anybody is unfamiliar with this concept of patronization, that's a great place to check out. So thank you for contributing that to our discussion. Next is Justin.
Hey, sorry, I was unmuting. My reaction to this was kind of from the angle of futurism. And I found myself replacing teacher with internet and students with people, and thinking more and more about how so many of us are trying to educate ourselves using the internet and putting terms into Google search engines. And, I think also through social media, this is starting to happen too. And I guess I was thinking about how these algorithms, we were told, I think, was going to kind of break down this dichotomy between subject and object, that algorithms were maybe going to have this ability to take away the hierarchy and maybe democratize information. But it seems like as time is going on, it's like the system is kind of turning on itself, and these algorithms are developing kind of a teacher role and seem to be selecting material and kind of prioritizing having a certain power over information. So I guess I just kind of wanted to throw that thought out there. I know it's a little different from what we've been talking about, but I do feel like, you know, a lot of good points have been raised, and Freire raised a lot of good points about traditional education. And I guess I'm thinking a little more forward, and also just, you know, this terrible problem we have of people having a certain feeling on an issue and typing something into Google or going on their social medias, and they just kind of end up going to omright.com, and we're not having the type of humanitarian dialogue that Freire is talking about. And I feel like that's an important thing for us to consider as we're trying to get our thoughts into the general public.
I think that's a valuable point to bring up. I also think I want to emphasize the creation of internet and the access to internet, right? And the access to the creation of internet, science and coding, etc. These are all various places that folks who have existed within the ruling class occupy, right? Rich white men are going to have an easier time getting into coding and creation of these things and these CEO positions of Facebook and Twitter and all of these places than those who have been oppressed, right? Because we exist in this system that prioritizes the ruling class already. So maybe it's not necessarily a problem of the internet or the algorithms or social media, right? But the people who have cultivated those things and who are in charge of those things. I am a Luddite. I do have a hard time with the internet, but I don't want to get too yangy up in here, you know? All right. I do think that's a valuable point to bring up, though, so thank you. Next in stack is Danny.
Hi, I just wanted to bring up that I thought, just in listening to Tongo and also just in reading, I thought that the idea of graduation or certification as kind of like meaning that you're done learning and that like you can now bestow knowledge onto other people and kind of you can kind of be the person to put the knowledge into the receptacle or whatever. I thought that I've just never thought of that. Like I've never seen my graduation as a point to stop learning necessarily, but I feel like that is kind of what it signifies and that is how it can be interpreted by a lot of people. So yeah, I just thought that that was interesting. I've never thought about that really before. And I thought that like that idea of kind of there's a point when you're done or you don't need to learn more is kind of part of what keeps reality static, because the people, once they get those positions of now I'm at a point where I can teach other people, it may lead people to stop learning and improving and seeking more knowledge in their field. So I thought that that was just something that was really interesting and kind of a way that I feel reality is kept unchanged. And then just another thing that kind of sparked my interest was this idea that like I know in all of my history classes and psych classes throughout the years, we've learned like all these philosophers, and basically it's a lot of the time it's centered around what does maintaining order mean, and it's kind of like how can we best maintain order? Is it like that should we assume that people are born good or people are born bad or you know whatever? But I think that just the idea of maintaining order and what that really means, like does maintaining order mean that reality is remaining unchanged? Does it mean like people aren't seeking more knowledge deeper into those things? Like it just makes me wonder, what does maintaining order really mean and who is it protecting? So yeah, that's all.
Thank you for bringing that up. I think also when we think about graduations, it is still like a function of it's like a pomp and circumstance of colonial educations, right? Which is interesting. I know a lot of people who do education outside. I know of somebody pursuing their PhD outside of a colonial institution to like discourage that from ever happening, which is very interesting and maybe something that you'd like to think about in the context of this conversation. Thank you for bringing it up. Next on stack is Michael.
Hey everybody, Michael here, he, him. I have a lot of different thoughts. So I guess first off, I'm a musician by trade. I'm a trombonist and I freelance as a musician, but that doesn't really pay many bills, maybe a couple bills. So I end up teaching a lot. I teach kids. So yeah, reading this chapter was kind of like sending off a lot of thoughts in my brain, making me think like, oh man, am I the cop? Kind of as Tongo was saying, I wasn't using that exact phrase, but that was kind of the feeling, you know, have I been the cop? How have I perpetuated harm? And also considering the education that I have received along the way. So I guess I was wondering, like, of the education I've had, and I just completed a master's, which is, you know, whatever, if you want to value that or devalue that. I ended up making the decision to do that, to get a master's in music, and just thinking about, I guess, my privileges and what that means, and also the education that I received, and working with people. So I don't know, sorry, I'm kind of rambling and I don't have a super pointed thought in that. I guess I just wanted to share that for starters. But I wanted to move on to what Amanda was saying a while back, saying something along the lines of like kids not, like at some point being taught not to trust our bodies. And I find that a lot in music. Even though I'm doing trombone, which is like an instrument, a lot of times we do singing because that's really critical to music education, is just to be able to sing what you're trying to play, even if you're not necessarily the best singer. And that's like a lot of times super triggering or embarrassing for people. And it was for me too. It took me many years to sort of try and work up the courage or feel fine with that, singing for myself. And it's been interesting doing that with kids and also adults. I teach adults sometimes too. And, you know, sometimes kids are totally fine. Like I used to broach it like this, like, oh, you know, it might be awkward to sing, but don't worry about it. And sometimes it wouldn't even be awkward for kids. Sometimes I would just be like, whatever, I don't know what that preface was, I'm just going to sing. Sometimes kids would feel awkward about it, and maybe that would be helpful. So I wonder if like even prefacing it as a potentially awkward thing was harmful, and maybe like saving that as a thing if they felt embarrassed about it, kids or adults. But that's definitely something I've encountered a lot, like singing, using of our bodies. Like sometimes with even younger kids, I might do general music and like sort of like dancing or movement type of stuff, and you know, sometimes they feel awkward about that or enjoy it. So I guess, yeah, this chapter made me think a lot about the way that I share knowledge or experience with kids, and hopefully not perpetuating harm. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think I had something else I wanted to say, but am kind of forgetting. Anyways, thanks for listening, and yeah, I'll sign off.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for sharing. I think it would be really, it could be really valuable. I know there are a lot of educators in this group. I encourage, if you want me to do it, I'll make a post on the Google Classroom that says like, oh, if you're an educator, feel free to converse here. So I think that could be really valuable for all of us. This chapter helped me a lot too in thinking about how I facilitate this group. So thank you for sharing and for your vulnerability. Next in stack is Gabs.
Hey, could y'all do like a thumbs up? I'm connected to Bluetooth, so I don't know if y'all can hear me. Okay, thank you. My pronouns are they and she, and I was like prompted to join the stack after listening to someone talk about the fear and creativity with like in regards to like painting, like when seeing kids paint. I think that was Amanda. And so that really just like jumped out to me when a bunch of you all were also adding things that you were saying about maintaining order and having, you know, children feel confident to express their creativity. I'm an 8th grade teacher, but I've also taught at a university level as well. And one of the things that really bothers me is how much teachers in like the traditional sense are expected to police students' bodies, and the way in which that kind of forces them to distrust themselves, their thought process, how they show up in certain spaces, and the ways in which adults are kind of expected to guide children on how to maintain order by like through self-surveillance. And when you were talking, Amanda, about like, you know, feeling that urge to kind of like point out something about their painting or point out something about, you know, the way a person is creating art, one of the things that stuck out to me is like, on the opposite end, for people who are teachers and who are taught to follow the traditional way of teaching. For example, I teach English, and there's a lot of issues with that as it results like pronouns and certain words that we use. And recently, this past year, I've come to meet a lot of students who are in the work of like creating their own words and creating, you know, specifically naming things that you don't have to do with gender and race or things that aren't even traditionally seen in the political scope. And so one of the things that that arose for me was the idea of like domination, and how education is a use of like domination towards a bunch of people. And so that just came to me, and that was on page 59. I have a hard copy, so I'm not using the PDF. But one thing that I don't know, I just would like to leave is like, I think when I work with children, and usually that discomfort arises in me when I'm being presented with something that was banking education through my own learning. Going through that process with them is where I kind of like try to break down that teacher-student relationship, and it becomes a teacher-teacher relationship, because at the end of the day, I'm pretty jaded by this society. And so that was what really stuck to me, was that. And then I know I'm talking a lot, but the next thing was with children, that idea of them not really, that with children and with the classroom and like releasing fear on the teacher side, I think the releasing of fear is like really key, and like people thinking that they'll lose control of the classroom, again, not putting the faith and trust in the students, and this is how we dehumanize them. And I feel like that's a big part of it there. And a lot of that fear, it talks about being threatened by the specter of reaction. And I think that our society creates a people who adapt by people who are afraid to confront, people who are afraid to ask meaningful questions that go beneath the layer of like the reality that we're often presented with. And so those are just some of the things that I see myself dealing with when I enter spaces of education, uprooting self-surveillance as it relates to like the oppressor and maintaining order, and the ways in which I have to combat my fear of like creativity and stuff. So that was a lot, but I want to thank everybody who shared, because all those things just like jumped out at me while y'all were talking. So thank you.
Thank you for sharing. I think it's great to hear from educators in the way that this has like impacted the way you view yourself in that setting. And I also want to encourage those of us who aren't traditional educators. These ideas, I know for me, manifest a lot in my interpersonal relationships with other people, with my comrades, with my family, right? Like I definitely have a fear with romantic partners, right? That I don't trust them, and it becomes like it can become a very authoritarian thing and something very oppressive in those situations. So even though this is talking about pedagogy and education, right? We all exhibit these, you know, practices in our daily lives and our interactions with other people by virtue of being in an oppressive society and system. So regardless, thank you very much for sharing your experience. And I hope that this book alters the way that you teach. That would be really cool. Next in stack is Sasha.
Hey everyone, I just wanted to say thank you first, everyone, for sharing their observations and their ideas. It's been really powerful listening to everyone speak. I wanted to respond specifically to Justin because I had a lot of similar overlapping ideas to them with regards to this futurist conceptualization of education and how people educate and how people are reliant on search engines and this sort of modality of education. And what I did that really helped me think through that particular contradictions, like I applied the theme of banking education versus problem posing education to that futuristic conceptualization. And what I think is, like, when you're using a search engine, when you're kind of interacting with these hidden algorithms on the internet, what that essentially is that's banking education, because you are a receptacle that is kind of like trying to, I don't know, gauge this or elicit a particular response from this singular entity, right? And that entity is the information that you're receiving is sort of being prescribed to you by the algorithm, is how I kind of interpreted that. And so what you're inevitably doing is you're sifting through walls of text, trying to find something meaningful in that. And so that to me is banking education. And I think a lot of, big tech companies and conglomerates, they want you to continue relying on their particular technology, because that prevents the users, the person who's trying to educate themselves, prevents them from self-actualizing and developing a critical consciousness. Like, you're not really engaging, you're literally just like Googling the same thing and remembering, like, it's memory versus experience, right? And so I think there's been recently this reclamation of the process of self-actualization by education, specifically on social media, where, if you find content and communities that are kind of creating their own educative materials, like I see it on Instagram a lot with, graphics and slides by, educators and people and activists. They are almost opening an invitation to that problem posing process, because a lot of these graphics and a lot of the ways that content is shared, it poses a problem. And I've found that just reading the content that I follow on my various social medias has been much more engaging and stimulating to my critical consciousness than a search engine ever could, And so, and moreover, if you can look to certain areas, like if you envision the internet as a space, you can find repositories of information, like free books, like the one that we're reading here, which is available to us, like in a downloadable format. And you can go further and really transform it into a radical pedagogy. I don't know if I'm saying that word right. Pedagogy, whatever. You can do stuff like you can print materials, you can print zines, and you can distribute them to people who don't have access to the internet. And it's important to remember the distribution of those resources, both digital and physical. Yeah, that's about it. So thanks, Justin, for unearthing all that for me.
Thank you, Sasha, for saying all of that. I think that was a much better way of saying what I was intending to say in response to Justin. So thank you for speaking. Yeah, I think, as with many things, when we invest in community models and collective models of using resources, it is more valuable to us all. So thank you. I put, there's an Instagram page that is specifically devoted to the dissemination of critical information from and for educators specifically. I think in traditional school settings, it's Educators for Justice on Instagram, if anybody is curious. But next in stack is Ross.
Okay, so the thing that the list made me think about specifically was dogma, and how, like, you know, there's constantly, you know, they're trying to end the dialectic, trying to end conversation, just like kind of make a clone of one generation onto the other. You know, it can be a mechanism for like conservative preservation. You know, and there's this in The Spectacle of the Society by Guy Debord, he talks about like propaganda in this way, that there's no dialogue to it. It's just like an advertisement that's shouting at you. You know what I mean? And we trying to sell you a specific kind of solution, this, that, or the other. Or, but of all, the loudest person that shouts at you is the salesman, and you know, from all directions you're constantly being assailed on. You know, just, and the other thing that I thought about like was when Tongo started talking about economics, and how you know, a lot of the economics is bullshit, but that's because it's not made for everyday people. It's made for the bourgeois and like understanding their profits. It's not talking about like evictions or like people's quality of life in some kind of holistic sense. You know, it can still be a science, but it's just like chooses what is relevant. You know, it's about choosing what is relevant. That's you know, one thing that you often see is it's not necessarily just an overt lie. It's stuff that's like controlling the narrative. And then another thing that I thought about, like with the whole rules and this kind of like teaching, you know, the new generation of workers, and is this kind of, you know, Marx talked about how like all of history is the history of class struggle. He's not talking about socioeconomic status. He's talking about how like people are trained to be specific tools for specific jobs throughout history. So like, for instance, like the history of femininity and womanhood is often like intertwined with like sexual and domestic labor. You know, those people are forced in and like, you know, being a housewife. Whereas a lot of like notions around masculinity are about forcing people to be warriors. And, you know, like all of the, like our schooling often like, you know, teaches you to be a specific kind of tool. You know, the bell that rings, that's like, when the Prussian school system was created, this whole bell ringing was supposed to mimic, you know, in the industrialists would have a bell that would ring when it was off for your time to work. So, but I mean, you see this beyond like gender roles, but also like, you know, if we go to like different societies with like that are minors, right? You know, like in the Andes, or in West Virginia, or like some of the Zulu people in South Africa that were forced to mine. You know, their entire life revolved around those minerals, and they built an entire culture around that. And like, you know, the rate at which they sang was, you know, about to keep time for manual labor. You know, the fear that they had, you know, the fears of like the fear of the dark, the demons of being buried alive, you know, there's a lot of, you know, your occupation and what like you were kind of forced to do historically, you know, would dictate your culture and what they force you to do throughout time. Yeah. I'm done.
Thank you for sharing that. I think those are all really valuable points. I do want to ask if you could define dogma as you're using it for those of us that might be unfamiliar with that term.
Oh, you really got me there. So, I mean, I think of it as something that's just unquestioned. I would only like have a layman's, feeling for it, but it's, there's no kind of dialogue. I guess that's kind of circular for what I was saying previously, but it's, it's something that is one-sided. It's not trying, like, people don't try to question it on a regular basis. I mean, there's certain things that we keep on coming back to. We question them, but like we keep on coming back to it and saying, oh, well, that's correct, but dogma is not like that. You don't question it.
It's almost like how we use hegemony in our conversations.
Yes.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you so much for sharing all of that. Next in stack is Elias.
This is something that was brought up quite a bit earlier, but I had a question about it. A few people touched on like the barriers that exist in, I guess, specifically arts professions, but I guess like we kind of opened it up to all professions and the barriers that exist for oppressed people to kind of excel in a lot of these areas, or I mean, not even excel, but just like, survive, not only thrive. So I'm like wondering how what it practically looks like for us to, I don't know, reclaim those resources. Like I think about something I've been thinking about a lot recently, being like from a Midwestern, like working class background. I never had any connections to coastal, like, I mean, I'm going to film school now. Like I never had, that's where the industry is. I never had any access to that industry. So I'm now like trying to get a job in that industry. I'm finding it difficult, obviously. So I don't know, I guess I'm wondering, what does it look like for us, I don't know, as people organizing, congregating together, like to kind of take that power back, that power of expression back?
I think that's a valuable question, and not to be too communist on the timeline, but the freedom arts movement, we believe that the liberation of people and creation, because we are all artists, is dependent upon the establishment of communism, the abolition of capitalism, because capitalism is what stifles us all. Again, as we had discussed, with the necessity of specialization in professions, and of course, the necessity of working, capitalism keeps us from being able to create and become, and etc. So that's where my opinion is. I'm curious to know if anybody else has other opinions. Would love to hear them after Maggie finishes up our stack.
Oh my gosh. Hi, everyone. My name is Maggie. I'm so nervous because I never talked in here before. So I'm a teacher, and a lot of us here are teachers, and Paulo Freire was a teacher. And so my question is,
Wait, Maggie, I want to know your question.
oh my God, like the feds just kicked me out, but I'm back.
Okay, welcome
Hello?
back. What's your question? Yes, we hear you.
Okay. So my question is, what role is the revolutionary in forging in a new model of education in our neighborhoods and where we live? And we know that public school is inadequate. We know that academia can be ableist and classist and exclude a lot of people. So how do we expect working people to develop the consciousness that's necessary for their liberation? So I brought out another Freire book that I own, which is called the Paulo Freire Reader. And in it, they've got some images that Paulo and his comrades used to use when they were teaching in the forest and wherever they would go and meet with people. So they would present these pictures to their students and use them as a spark for dialogue, because a lot of their students didn't know any letters and couldn't read. But this was how they would begin to build that consciousness. So through these pictures, they would have dialogue, and the dialogue would point to certain things. Like, you can imagine looking at this and talking about, like, what's the difference between a hunter and, you know, the prey? What's the difference between pursuing something and hunting something? You know, what is a gun? Is a gun a tool that is always used against us, or whatever? I'm just kind of rambling. Okay. So through all of these images, people would learn, like, we are objects, we can make culture, you know, we can transform, we make art. And you know, I showed a few of these pictures to my students. I was teaching 7th grade last year, but ultimately I think that's like a really good idea, and I think learning from him is important. But I think, like, looking at of COVID on schools and just what's going to happen in the next 20, 30, and 40 years, we can see a complete collapse of the infrastructure of public education in the United States. And I think that revolutionary people need to be really planning ahead and thinking long term about how the consciousness raising can happen, and how we as communists will help the people overcome their false sense of reality and turn the world into an object for us to transform.
Thank you very much. Thank you for speaking. That was really valuable. That is a super cool book. Thank you. Yeah, great. Okay, next in stock is Yammer. Is that better?
Yes, J silent. Thank you.
Okay.
I cannot answer that question, I don't think, but I wanted to address what Elise was saying earlier about how can we also be financially, I guess, independent in these communities that we are creating, in society that we are creating. I personally imagine a society, right, like that's using the dialogue as a tool, not just towards our own sense of critical consciousness, but to share skills in a way. Because through that dialogue, just like the person who went before me said, like, we can actually experience what is going on in that picture. And so through the dialogue, maybe we can experience what that person knows about a topic and a subject. And so that way, maybe a skill share based society would actually thrive more, while being, allowing us to become independent ourselves and kind of in touch with reality and constantly learn, but also probably elevate all of us together, because we are sharing everything we know, and not just to seek knowledge, but like skills that are, I guess, required to be more complete. I know the goal is not to be complete, but to constantly become. But I guess maybe skill share is one of the ways that I feel like it's necessary for us to have, to allow everybody the same kind of ability. But I don't know what everybody else thinks.
Yeah, I think that's a great concrete what we can do tomorrow as artists or creators in experiencing liberation. That's really cool and valuable, and thank you for bringing that up to us. We'll do that alongside destroying capitalism. Next up is Danny.
Hi, I wanted to reply to the comment someone made about like the book and everything. I thought that like the drawings, that one, I was in a class like a couple months ago, I guess, and it was basically like an education innovation class, and somebody came to speak to the class about her kind of curriculum curriculum she created for students who had lived in one country at one point of their lives and then now lived in America or the United States. And so, yeah, I just found it really interesting. One method that she spoke about was that if students were asked to kind of speak about their experiences or to understand the like complexity of having different government systems, different belief systems, it was like within like a room of their peers, a lot of the time, like they didn't want to speak up or they didn't have the terminology to speak about those experiences. Whereas if they were asked to create something like create a poem about a topic and then to deconstruct the poem, or to look at a picture and deconstruct the picture, a lot of the time that kind of education can lead populations to, or at least like young populations, like very young, like I think the students were like 4 or 5 or 6, to kind of have a better understanding of their experience. And I think to answer the question that was raised kind of about how to fix the fact that public education is so inadequate and how to educate populations about their own circumstances, I think that really is key. And using different methodologies and to teach people how to understand their experiences, I think that's a really important part of breaking down the entire system of capitalism and everything. So yeah.
Absolutely. Again, you know, it ties into what I think, as long as we are engaging in anything that is not this banking model narrative model of education, as long as it is something that destroys the dichotomy between the teacher and the student, the object and the subject, then we are progressing collectively. So cool. Thank you for sharing that, Danny. Next is Michael.
Hey all, I was having a couple of thoughts regarding Elias's question a while back. Like, how do we sort of put some of this stuff to use in, like, I guess a more immediate kind of way? And I was sort of reflecting, well, first off, somebody made a comment earlier in the chat, like public schools are inherently violent. It's just a violent system used to oppress children. So I think with that in the foreground, if a person is going to work within that system, acknowledging that it's inherently oppressive and a violent system, and if you're within that system trying to work, I guess the work, I think, is kind of more like harm reduction, acknowledging that it's impossible to take the kids out of that harmful system, unless you completely broke it. But you, as a worker within that system, can hopefully try and reduce the harm. I think that's really the best you can do. I'm also reflecting, I said that I primarily do a lot of private teaching because that's how I can make a lot of money, but there have also been times in my life when I was like a teaching artist and I was like a specialist who would go into a school. And a lot of times, stepping back for a second, I'm a cis white man. And a lot of times the schools I was going to were predominantly children of color. Like, I'm in Boston, so we'd go to East Boston, and there was a lot of Latinx kids who were like first generation kids of immigrants, or we'd go to another school on like Mission Hill or the South End, and it was mostly Black African-American kids. And I think just acknowledging the fact that just merely me being a white cis man as an educator in that space speaks volumes without me even saying a word. Just that there's some system that's paying me to go into that space, a white man, just another white man who's going to teach them. The fact that they won't have representation of somebody who is more familiar with their own experience, because that's not my experience. I didn't grow up in those neighborhoods. That's not my experience. So it's an incredibly challenging and delicate place to be, I guess, like considering what jobs we even decide to take as educators. And if you do find yourself in that position, being extremely careful about your blind spots and your implicit biases. Yeah, I think one of the most memorable things my experience was like this one boy who was in and out of the foster care system who had a lot of trouble, and he had a total meltdown one time, and he started like throwing these water bottles that we made as shakers, and thank God the school handled it well, as did we as teachers. And we handled it in a way that, you know, this little boy was like third grade or something. He wasn't, you know, nobody called the cops on him. We were able to de-escalate the situation. You know, we tried to keep the class going for as long as possible and let him sort of like run his anger out. But when he didn't stop, eventually some extra help, some social workers came by, some people that he trusted, and were able to sort of calm him down without having to use police violence, which I think would unfortunately be extremely common in a lot of situations. So that's my perspective on your question. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing that. I want to implore you to remember that public school is violent because of the ways in which education exists, right? And also, as long as like oppressors are in power, all of our systems will be violent against those who are oppressed. I also want to encourage you to remember that social workers are often not a better alternative to policing. They are still agents of the state and can still be violent. And I think that your presence as a member of the ruling class in those spaces becomes dangerous when you are adopting that narrative form of education, right? When you are not seeing yourself as equally a student as you are a teacher, and your students as equally teachers as they are students in, you know, pedagogy of the oppressed's view. So that's my initial reaction to that. We're gonna finish up Stack in these last couple of minutes with Amanda, Josephine, and then B. I will provide the platform for you all to speak. Obviously, what else am I doing? So go for it.
Thanks, Gabrielle. So I wanted to respond to what Elias asked, just because I want people to feel like hopeful and that there's things that we can do, like tomorrow, even if it's like going at a snail's pace. And so I'm gonna put that into the chat, which is part of the sheet that I put in the chat last time, which is just like some tools. But this tool is a way in which people can co-counsel each other. So instead of there being a hierarchy of a therapist and a client, it becomes like a horizontal where the counselor is counsels the client, and then you switch, and then the client becomes the counselor, so that there's complete reciprocity. And the way that it's most helpfully done is that if it's completely confidential. So if you are going to do this, I would suggest you do it with someone that you trust a little bit, and then you feel like they can keep confidentiality, which means that whatever you say during your time as client, they can not tell other people, but also not bring it up to you. So not refer to anything that you said, and vice versa. And so the reason why I give this as a tool is because if we're trying to figure out how to follow our own thinking, we need to have space to actually go to those places where we can, or we don't need to, but it might be helpful to find a space where you can express yourself in a way that you feel you won't be judged. And so as the counselor, you know that whatever that person is saying makes sense for them, and that's like their reality, and it's not for the counselor to be telling the client what to think or try to give suggestions, because this is like, we've been getting suggestions our whole lives, right? That our mind isn't good. And so if you have a space to express yourself where someone isn't trying to figure out how to respond to you or help you, but just giving you space to clear out some stuff and air it out, that's helpful. And so I'm just gonna leave that there, but it's like a hard process, because you have to be able to give someone attention without wanting to do anything with their words, which is really difficult. And then it's also very difficult to receive attention, because none of us actually receive attention in our lives very often. And so I just want to say that as just like a little precursor to like, if you want to try this, don't just let the first time be the time that you decide if it makes sense or not, because it's hard to get to that point where you can express yourself. But I just want to give that as like a little tool if people want to use that to process whatever.
Yeah, thank you for that. And again, you know, it ties into Freire's whole concept of dialogue as liberation, right? That is quite literally just a dialogue between community members that will result in self-expression and liberation of the self. So super sick. Thank you so much, Amanda. Next is Josephine and then B.
Hi, can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. I've been thinking or doing a lot of work locally, or just thinking about scale and who is in my reach. So it extends to like family members, it extends to friends, it extends to like people that I have political affinity with, and trying to think about how to scale conversations with all the participants that are involved. So the ideas might be the same across the board, but each person like has their own journey of how they're going to arrive there. And I'm really realizing how much it's important for people to find their own agency and arrive there on their own. So I've been doing like, I think like these kinds of study groups are really important to do. And I think that maybe what felt like a hiccup for me last week was that we are, even though we are like broadly interested in some sort of like political affinity, there's still like people coming from all different places, and that the terms and conditions maybe haven't been laid out like as a group. Like we haven't decided on certain terms or what they mean to ourselves. And something I do in like smaller groups is I have a few different ways that people can kind of engage at the same time in like a discussion group. So like we have like a live collaborative document that people can like take notes in, or like add ideas in, or links, like all the steps that we're doing in the chat. But that we also like spend time defining words together, like somebody had mentioned already in the group. I find that really useful, because then like when those terms come up, we have like a really broad understanding of like what all of that is. So I'm curious like if there's ways that we could think about like how to practice some of that stuff in this group, because I think there's so many like rich ideas, and we can go deep in some places, but maybe this like 2 hours is actually like too short in a weird way to do that. And I know this is like life's journey work to do, but yeah, so thank you for organizing this. I think this is like really a special way to get to engage with other people.
Thank you for the compliments. Yeah, I think that in theory, that sounds like a great idea. I think all of this would be so much easier if we were able to be together and share physical space together. Zoom is such an odd platform to do this on. If anybody has ideas on how to implement that, I'm very open to critique. I think also we really encourage this variation of ideas existing here, because that does further the dialogue and the conversation and the struggle. So that's, you know, and yes, 2 hours feels like too short somehow, but also, do I want to spend 6 hours with you guys? I like you all, but is it that much? You know, I don't know. I'm joking. I probably could. Next in stack though is B, and of course, obviously, please reach out to me if you have any ideas on how to implement that.
Hey everybody, hope y'all have had a good day. I came here kind of late, so sorry about that, but I just really enjoyed getting to hear the conversation I got to hear, and I guess I just wanted to extend like a thank you to all of you just for helping to create this space. This is actually going to be my second time reading through Pedagogy of the Oppressed, so I'm very excited. But yeah, I think one thing I found really interesting is, you know, we were talking a lot about public education and how, you know, and like how it's an inherently oppressive system, which I'm assuming by that we just mean like kind of the current structure of public education is what it is. But I do think in like some way, what we're doing right here is like what public education truly is, right? Like this is what a real public platform of us educating each other can look like. And I think you can like kind of create these spaces in smaller ways. And I'll definitely admit some bias because I volunteered at a public school for about 2 years, and so like I agree fundamentally with like the structure of current school systems is not created for educating children. It is created for indoctrinating new working people, essentially. But I think even in those highly oppressive spaces, it can be really important to try and find those small moments where you can create that space, where you can have that dialogue with students. Like, you know, sometimes, and it's easier said than done for sure, but sometimes like, you know, it's just like, it's more important to give, like, just be like, all right, kids, we're not doing a math lesson today. We're going to talk about our feelings. And it's really corny. Or just like asking kids how their days was. It's really difficult. And as I said, I fully admit to having some bias here because of my background, working in an educational environment. But I think, when we think about public education, I think we need to think of it with a goal of like reclamation and kind of creating a true educational praxis, and kind of like how can we take these structures that, you know, it's like people think like, you know, if you talk to people about like public education, people like want public education to exist. We need to get to a point where we can challenge people's ideas of what is a true education, and is this what you want is this what you want it to be? Sorry, I kind of rambled a bit. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think, you know, as everything, revolution as a process, if you're an educator, these are ways that you implement revolution in your role as an educator, which is very valuable and really cool to hear too. So thank you very much for your input. That being said, that is the end of our stack. It is now 6 p.m. Eastern time. Would anybody else like to say anything, or can we go ahead and wrap up? Okay, beautiful. Thank you so much. All right, have a great week. I will see you next week. We'll be discussing chapter 3. I'm looking forward to it. Bye.